Hi, curious friends. Welcome back to Building Your Best Brain podcast, or if it's your first time here, just simply hello and welcome. My name is Sylvie. I am almost done my PhD in neuroscience. If you caught the last episode, I talked a little bit about the really interesting, humbling, and ultimately empowering lessons that I learned writing my PhD thesis. And I am a little over a month away from my defense, which is really exciting and wild, but that's a topic for another day. But the Building Your Best podcast, Building the Best Brain podcast, I should say, building your best what, Sylvie? Best brain is all about being your most well-resourced self. And what I mean by that is that all of the science that I provide, the education, the tools, the applications are really guided towards rewiring your brain for ultimate resilience. So it's not having a perfect brain, it's not having a brain that never experiences any obstacles, but it's about having a brain that is flexible, that is able to maneuver through obstacle, that's able to find its way back to balance more easily. And what I've been doing, because we're over 40 episodes in, so there's been a lot of science that's been shared. But what I've been really enjoying that I've been doing more recently is creating these series where we talk about a topic for kind of 3, 4 episodes. They're great standalones, but they also build off of each other. And I like I like this because we get to dive in deeper into a subject, which I think is really important. There's a lot of what I like to call like science junk food on the internet, which, if it's true, right, and not kind of clickbait driven, I think is great. There's nothing wrong with a little junk food here and there, consuming kind of 1 to 2 minute reels of science facts. But science does hit different when you dive into it deeper. And with the opportunity, like a podcast, to dive into it deeper, we can start asking questions of, does this apply to my life? How does it apply to my life? How can I start tinkering with this so that I can show up as my fully resourced self? So that when push comes to shove and there's an obstacle or a stressor or a condition in front of me that is not ideal, I'm still proud at how I reacted or how I moved through it. And with that preamble, the series that we're going to dive into for the next 3, 4, maybe more episodes, we'll see how far we get, is the balanced brain. So diving into the neuroscience on the balanced brain. And what I mean by balanced brain is honestly a lot of what I just said, but it really is having that flexibility to come back to a balanced state, come back to what we like to think of as an optimal state. And when I think of balanced brain, when it comes to certain illnesses, not a lot of illnesses are because there's something, how am I going to word this? I almost want to say because there's something inherently wrong. And what I mean by that is that somebody has a mutation. So let's say a specific gene has, a particular what we call nucleotides, right? Because our DNA is full of nucleotides and it's basically like a book. And when we read that book in our body knows like what proteins to produce, what pathways to push forward. It's basically the book on how our body lives our life. So some diseases, of course, involve mutation. So there's actually something that's read not properly. Sometimes there are, I almost want to say, foreign things, right? So, if you get a virus or if you catch a bacteria, right, something that your body is not designed to conquer and take over, those are causes for various diseases. But another cause is that our body has almost over adapted to a particular situation. So if we have a stressor or if we have a particular event or, you can insert a lot of things in this part, but basically our body knows how to adapt to meet a certain situation. And it will do that, right? It'll maybe produce more of a certain protein. It'll maybe get your brain to fire a certain way. But the intention of this adaptation was that it would be temporary and not for a long period of time. And so a lot of diseases can arise of being in that state for too long, which is why I wanted to talk about the balanced brain. Something that I'm particularly passionate about, something that I work a lot with people when it comes to brain training is how to bring that flexibility to come back, basically to come back home to yourself in a way. And so I'll deal with this in many different episodes and many different parts. But the first thing I want to ask you guys, diving into the first episode of The Balanced Brain, is what if your brain could do more with less? What if the answer was to do less and not to do more? Anybody feeling uncomfortable? I know this is something that, there is a lot of great science behind this, and I don't know if the science has fully caught up with mainstream media. I've definitely heard a lot of this in the spiritual community, right? Of, not pushing and, feeling pulled to do things and that, less is more. And I've certainly heard it in the science when it comes to physical training, right? So growing muscle, building more endurance, better cardio, right? Olympic athletes don't train 24/7, right? Like 7 days a week nonstop, right? They have periods of rest that are really purposeful. And your brain has the same. And before I dive into the science behind what this looks like, I want to share with you how I've experienced boredom, right? Which is essentially what doing less is, right? Doing less is taking breaks, and taking breaks, not scrolling on your phone breaks, because that's not a break for your brain. Your brain is lighting up like fireworks when you do that. But taking meaningful breaks, boredom, just straight up being bored, what being bored does for your brain and what kind of benefits you can have. Now, if you were to tell me that this was the key, one of the keys to getting the most out of your brain, even in a work sense, right? That you would be more productive if you had more intentional, meaningful breaks where you were bored. I would have resisted it like my entire life depended on it. And that is because I, for a long time, was very success achievement goal driven. Not to say that I'm not, right? Because nobody, not a lot of people that do a PhD are not goal driven, right? So don't be out here calling me a hypocrite unless you really, really want to go for it. I recognize that I am still very goal driven, but the motivation for my goals now is very different than when it was. And this would have been around the time that I finished my master's, which was a great experience, but in a lot of ways a disaster. And I'll link, I'm sure I have an episode where I talk about it more in depth, and I'll create one, I promise. Finished my master's, a complete burnout, and then I started working in the biotech industry. And, I was treating it more than a full-time job. Granted, it was a startup, so it was more than a full-time job in a lot of ways. Everybody was wearing what we'd like to say multiple different hats. And we had these really, what was fun about a startup is that, you know, if you believe, right, which I did, if you believe in the product and the technology, it's easy to be motivated to push. And so, I was taking calls New Year's Eve, Christmas Eve. We were pushing for what we call an IND, which is a new drug file, for a clinical trial to help with cancer. And that was all really motivating for me. And as I worked there more and more, I had a really hard time achieving work-life balance. And the reason for that wasn't just because I was success and goal driven, but this underneath the success and being driven towards goals was a fear. And it was a fear that I was not good enough, essentially. But if I were to get more particular, it was that I was not smart enough. So every extra thing I was doing, every extra email I was sending, every extra work I was doing on the weekend was because I wanted to resolve this fear that I didn't even realize was a fear at the time, that I was not smart enough. And I was not smart enough to be successful, to be able to do what I want to do out of life, to be able to take care of myself financially, right? That like the world was going to find out that I was dumb, basically. And this is what I like to call a core stress circuit, where, we have a few of these in our brain that when we're stressed or we confront a stressor, it that circuit is also active at the same time. And it can get really strong to the point that you don't notice it. And I'll put a link in the show notes there. But the reason why at the time when I was working in biotech, before I did my PhD, before I jumped and did a complete shift, it was that boredom felt threatening to me because I thought that doing more, which is something that this core circuit is something that I work on all the time. Doing more meant that I was going to be successful. And for me at the time, what success meant was that, nobody was going to find out that I was dumb. And so if you have, and I'll circle back to this, but if you have any resistance around what I'm saying, it could be, right, that there's an underlying fear around what it means to slow down. What does it mean about you to slow down? What does it mean about your life? And that's a beautiful thing to know, because there's a lot of really great evidence that having breaks and being bored is way better for your brain in the context of work, which is really cool. And this is something that, working through some of those core stress circuits that really were present when I was working in biotech. I mean, they'd been around for a long time. I got diagnosed with ADHD. They tried to diagnose me when I was young, but the tests were not, I don't want to say they weren't sophisticated enough, but I suppose they weren't in depth enough. And I was struggling in school, was struggling to do my homework. And I got diagnosed with ADHD officially when I was 17, when I did a more thorough assessment. So this feeling like I wasn't smart enough or not good enough in the like career school space was something that had been present for a very, very long time. But once I shifted that, I was able to make more productive breaks. And sometimes I struggle because I feel like I need to do more. And that's something that I'm continuing to work on, a topic for another time. But this really, and this is what's cool with the brain, is that once you start gathering evidence and your brain is like convinced, it's really hard to unconvince yourself. It's one of my favorite teachers would always say, you can't unknow something, right? You can't like unsee, you can't unknow something. And so during my PhD, I came across an obstacle, I suppose 2 years ago. So I'm like 5 years into my PhD. So this would have been kind of a little over the halfway point. And I was wrapping up things for my major project and was in the process of writing a paper for it, making figures. We had not submit the paper yet to a journal. And I, at the time, was signed up for a conference on the cells that I study, which are astrocytes. Again, a topic for another time, but for people who know what astrocytes are, just raising the roof a little over here. And it was fun because it was actually at my old undergrad. So they had this like CanGlia conference. And I signed up to present a poster because I was like, oh, it's great. Like I'll see some of my old professors. And, I have a poster ready. I have family, right? So I study in Montreal. I grew up in Ottawa. That's where my old university is, in Ottawa, so I get to see family, friends, lots of wins. And I looked at the itinerary, and one of the keynote speaker, his subject line was alarmingly similar to the title of my paper, and my heart and stomach dropped. And I told my supervisor, and we agreed, and I suggested it, that I don't present at this conference because clearly, and this is maybe not everybody knows this, but with publishing in science, there is a bit of a race. Whether that's a good thing because it pushes innovation, it pushes people to think outside of the box, it pushes people to share the results, or it's a bad thing, as in maybe the science gets a bit rushed, it's not the best quality, maybe it encourages people to fudge their data, meaning make it up. I was like, okay, well, clearly we're in like direct competition with each other, so I don't feel comfortable presenting my poster with this person being around. And he was like, you know what, I agree. And then we did a bit of digging and saw a bioarchive of their paper. And so this is a preprint, and often people will do this. So journals will peer review before publishing, which means that it goes through the hands of 2 or 3 different professors that give you comments, additional experiments. You do the review process and submit it back. But as a way to kind of almost claim your territory, like I'm doing this topic first, you can submit it to bioRxiv, which is a journal that allows for preprint and no peer review. So it's not really published, but it's almost like kind of a warning flag. So these guys, they did a warning flag, and my supervisor and I found it, and my heart dropped again, my stomach dropped again. I felt devastated. I remember I went home, I crawled into bed, and my partner, he wasn't living with me at the time. He was messaging me like what to pick up food-wise, and I think I had like some chips or some chocolate, and I was in bed with my laptop reading the paper, highlighting it, crying. It's like science but dramatic. And I told, my supervisor later, like what I thought, kind of what was similar, what wasn't similar. And then he saw them at a conference a few weeks later and found out that were they approved? They were in revision, or they were close to being approved for Nature Neuroscience, which, if you don't know, is like la crème de la crème, top tier journal. So they were going to be the first to publish on this topic in a top tier journal. And I was like, what on earth am I going to do? And I remember feeling so overwhelmed, so full of emotion. And, you know, I remember telling Keith, I need a few days. And I truly, yeah, I don't think I came into the lab for 2 or 3 days. I maybe went in to feed my cells because, on top of all this, I wasn't going to just let them die. And I went for walks. I made food. I maybe read some papers, but not a ton. I stayed off of social media. I watched like some favorite movies. So I definitely wasn't tuned out. Like I was still paying attention to emails. I don't think I created anything for Synaptic Sylvie, which is my social media accounts on Instagram, TikTok, and Rumble. I meditated. I remember feeling all sorts of ways, and I meditated for an hour, and I set an intention. So I just put on some music. I put on some binaural beats, theta binaural beats, if you're curious. And I meditated for an hour with the intention of surrendering. I was like, you know what? Like, I'm going to surrender. Like, this has happened. This is where I'm at. And I asked my brain, I was like, please show me whether it's now or like a few days from now, what the best path forward is. And I remember I did that. And it was maybe the next day or the day after. The answer just came. This might sound silly. I heard it. And then there was this kind of like knowing in my body that, like that is the way forward. And I remember initially actually being a bit not crazy upset at my supervisor, but was surprised that my supervisor didn't take the charge more. And in the beginning, I was kind of like, oh, like I just wish he would tell me like what to do. But I'm so glad that he didn't. And I remember I was like, all right, like I'm ready for a meeting. And we had a meeting and I told him exactly what it was that I wanted to do, where I wanted to submit, to keep moving forward, whatever. And he completely agreed. And I mean, what happened was that my work still got published and it got published in a reasonably good journal. And I was able to keep the momentum, but I know that if I didn't take those 2, 3 days to pause, again, it wasn't completely turned off, but it was like, I'm not thinking about what I'm going to do in regards to this actively. And I'm going to do things that promote being bored, right? So walks without a podcast. An hour-long meditation is not easy. And it's not easy to try and not think about the topic that is bothering you the most. But when you give your brain that space, there is, I say magic, it's also science that happens, that it allows it to come up with creative solutions and it allows ideas to truly just drop in. And that's where, I have no doubt, right, that when we look at really great companies, right, companies that have stood the test of time, companies that create great products, great services, that though that leadership, right, the head of that company is not doing all the time. I'm sure that they have a lot of responsibilities and that they're juggling a lot. And of course, they work hard. But when you are, and it's the same for our own life, when you are the visionary, the head, you do need space to come up with new ideas, new innovation, a new take on things. And that's where boredom becomes really, really powerful. And when I dive into the science behind this, I will come back around to how to integrate it in your life, right? But I just want to convince you that being bored is productive and does propel your life forward in a way that like almost nothing else can, right? It can't be replaced by doing more work or thinking about a problem harder or, scrolling on your phone for answers. And so I'll present to you some of the really cool findings when it comes to what your brain looks like when it's bored and how do we start integrating that into our daily life. The first thing I want to talk about when it comes to what your brain looks like when it's bored is the default mode network, which you've definitely heard from me. You've also probably heard it from many other people. But in the brain, we do have these networks. And what that means is that multiple brain regions will be active at the same time doing a specific task, usually. So it's what we call functional connectivity. So they might not be, sometimes they will be physically connected through different neurons and synapses, but they're functionally connected in the sense that they all turn on at the same time. And so the default mode network is known to basically be active when we're no longer focusing on the outside world. So when we're focusing on the outside world, different networks get turned on. But when we let that go, and usually when we allow the focus to be inward, the default mode network turns on. And there's 4 structures that turn on in the default mode network. So we have one in the front called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is often scanning and evaluating, and then, of course, kind of turning it back in on yourself, right? So that's where like the self-reflection piece comes in, right? So evaluating your external environment and then going, okay, what does that mean about me? What does that mean about my life? What does that mean about my circumstance? There are a few structures in the what we call limbic region, and that's the middle of your brain. Those are centers that are often involved in emotional regulation, memory formation, learning. And one of them is the posterior cingulate cortex, which is getting studied more and more, which is really exciting. But that's more, people think that's kind of the area where you have the sense of self and internal awareness. And it's really close to our hippocampus, which is where our memories are formed. So it can also kind of use memories to reinforce certain beliefs we have of ourselves. Not saying that beliefs only live here. Beliefs is a bit of a tricky one to pinpoint in the brain, but the posterior cingulate cortex is involved in kind of the awareness of ourselves. We also have in this limbic region the angular gyrus, and this is where a lot of our what we call semantic processing, so how we process words, how we derive meaning. And then in our temporal lobe, our medial temporal lobe, so our temporal lobe, right, we have our prefrontal in the front, and then further back, like all the way at the back, we have our occipital lobe, which is for our vision. Underneath that is the temporal lobe, right? So it kind of comes back around on itself a little bit, the brain. And this is also involved in memory. Hippocampus is around this region, and also a lot of other emotional processing centers, like the amygdala, for example, which is our fear center. And so the default mode network is interesting, right? Because it's also studied quite a bit in the context of depression, because it's thought to be involved in self-rumination, right? So in some contexts, having too much activity in your default mode network can be considered not great for your brain. But when you are tuning out the outside world, often the default mode network are the groups of structures I just mentioned that are active. And this can really start shifting towards reflection, remembering, imagining, and integrating. So, like anything, right? Too much of anything is not great. Even too much of spinach is not great. So, same with the default mode network. And there has been, and I'll put the link in the show notes, the two studies that I'm referencing, but there has been a study that looks at creativity in the default mode network, and that they've been able to study and measure, activity in the default mode network, and then look at different outputs in terms of how creative people are. And this is something my partner has said, which I think is so true, right? That social media, email, news outlets, right? Things being able to be super accessible to our phone means that, you know, the way he phrased it was that, you know, will there be any great movies anymore? Will there be any great books written anymore? And this was something that we were just discussing casually. Like, I don't think he truly has this fear and it keeps him up at night or anything, but I understand what he says, right? Because creativity really does get birthed out of boredom. And they have linked the default mode activity as a part of the creative process. And there was another study that looked at this even more specifically, looking at it from a problem solving angle, which is extremely similar to what I confronted a few years ago in my PhD, right? Where I basically got what we call in science scooped and needed to figure out, okay, well, this happened. How do I move forward? How do I solve this problem? And the way they did that was by basically creating different tasks. So before presenting participants with a complex problem, they gave specific tasks, right? So there was a group that had a demanding task that, really needed all of their attention and they had to really, really focus. The second group got a simple, repetitive, boring task. So it was a task that required like a little bit of attention, but people could basically do in their sleep, and it was a bit boring. Or the third was nothing. There was no break, nothing. They just dove into the task right away. And what they found was that the group that had the boring task, the repetitive task, did perform better afterwards. They were able to problem solve better afterwards. And they call it kind of creative problem solving. And this group, they title this, or they kind of coined this phenomenon in a really cute way, which is that they're calling it creative incubation. So it's basically like the brain is not actively working on it, but it is integrating information in the background. And so what the researchers propose is that doing low demand activities does help your brain continue to solve the problem without you actively paying attention towards it. And that is more effective than diving into the problem right away, or, which is interesting, right, doing high demanding cognitive tasks before. And that's where, with my example, and I'm sure maybe you have an example or you're going to create an example, which is spicy, taking it easy for 2, 3 days. Not that I was doing nothing, but that I wasn't doing a lot of cognitively tough tasks at the time. And so, needless to say, I think you guys can already imagine what my call to action is going to be, which is to carve out time to be bored throughout your day. And you know what this would be really great for, which I do, is if you can, finding times in your day where you maybe feel the most cognitively depleted, right? So whether that's like being able to take a walk at work after lunch, or maybe it's before you make dinner or after you make dinner. And again, scrolling on your phone doesn't count. That's very active for your brain, but it's also not making the task so boring that you're like that you're kind of putting pressure on yourself to do it, because that's also not going to help. There is a bit of a fine balance with this. And so the examples that I've kind of sprinkled throughout, right, is going for a walk, but not listening to a podcast, cooking, and maybe not watching a show while you cook. What's another good example? I have a list of good examples. Hold on. Gardening, repetitive tasks. Meditation, of course, is a great one. Sitting with your coffee without your phone in your hand, staring out the window for a little bit, those kinds of things, sprinkling that throughout your day so that you're almost giving your brain a break, but you're really giving your brain an opportunity to figure it out for you without you having to try so darn hard all the time. Now, if you've come to the end of this episode and that whole concept seems kind of threatening, I understand. This is where getting into what your fear is underneath slowing down is going to be really helpful. And when you shift that, it's going to make this kind of exercise so much easier. Now, keep me posted how it goes. You can DM me on Synaptic Sylvie. You can chat in the comments of whatever platform you're listening to. I always love to hear how you integrate this into your daily life, or attempt to, right? I know it's a big ask, but it's definitely incredibly beneficial for your brain. And if you're ready to dive deeper, or if you want to be able to integrate things easier, get results faster, I offer complimentary webinars 2, 3 times a month. And we dive into different topics. And this is where, again, we dive into topics even deeper than we do here. And it's all about questions, right? So you come to me with your questions, I give you your answers, you figure out, what's personalized to you, what makes sense for your situation, and you basically cut the noise that way. And you experience transformations a lot quicker. And the way to get on that is to get on my email list. My email list has no selling. I'm not about that. Maybe I should be, but I'm not. But that's where you'll see the dates for the webinars and learn about the topics, learn how to sign up, learn how to submit your questions, especially if you can't make it live. I'm definitely open to people sending questions in advance and taking the time to answer them. And so if that's something that's of interest to you, you can see in the show notes where you can sign up. And with that, give yourself a board break. Maybe go for a walk, have a nice drink, stare out your window, pet your pet. And I look forward to diving into the next chunk of this series, all about the balanced brain. Thank you for your time. I'm wishing you a wonderful rest of your day.